personal and sometimes tragic concerns. Specifically, the concerns of people caught in the nightmare of human trafficking. Lots of things cross borders these days, we're learning, right? Including people. Sometimes against their will, or sometimes when they get here, they find themselves enslaved. Slavery is alive and well. It's sad to say. Emily Sims is a hero of Marin. She was called that by the Marin newspaper. She is the founder of a nonprofit called West Marin Advocacy, which is the driving force behind the Marin County Human Trafficking Task Force. She's here to talk to us in the ways she would talk to social workers and law enforcement workers about these issues. She has studied at Golden Gate University, Dawson College, and Sonoma State University. She has lots of things to tell you about how to use your college degree for good in the world, let me say. She for MA. She has lots to tell you. She has worked for years in the areas of domestic violence prevention, human rights, disaster relief, emergency services, human trafficking, and much more. Please give a huge FYE welcome to Emily Sims.
This can be a very personal topic. I myself am a survivor of human trafficking. My experience did not require me being crossed across a border. A lot of human trafficking we think of as people going from one country to another against their will or with the promise of a good job. But human trafficking exists within one state. There doesn't have to be a requirement of going across that state line. It happens in counties such as this. There's quite a bit of human trafficking here in Sonoma County, and we'll talk about how that happens, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So I returned to Sonoma State as a 31-year-old single mom, very low income. It was through the Public Administration Master's Program, as well as the Upper Division Women's and Gender Studies classes that I was able to piece together this interdisciplinary master's degree. I was fascinated with why there was no response to human trafficking crimes in Marin County. All of the other Bay Area counties, including Sonoma County, had really been leaders in addressing human trafficking, and Marin County was a little bit behind the times. There's a lot of affluence and quite a bit of labor trafficking that exists of people who are forced to work as nannies, maids, gardeners, and in the agricultural settings in our more rural parts of the community, as well as sex trafficking. I was a resident of Marin County almost the entire time that I was trafficked from 19 to 21. So I'm going to give you the same training that I give law enforcement and social workers. Some of these slides are a little bit dense in content, so I'm going to just go a little quicker through them in the interest of time. For those of you who are interested in going into a career in social work or administration of justice, criminal justice, please let me know. I'd be happy to provide this PowerPoint to you, the entire thing via email. So I have this sort of awkward way of toggling through the slides, and if I accidentally hit a button, we'll just try to deal with glitches. So this can be a very traumatizing topic. It deals with a lot of racism issues. It deals with a lot of homophobia, a lot of classism. So if at any point anything becomes a little bit too triggering, you're welcome to leave the room. Raise your hand if you'd like me to tone it down. I try to keep the language very trauma-informed because I understand that people who study topics such as this often come to it for personal reasons. And if we can try to just put any judgments to the side, there's a lot of judgments at times around prostitution. I like to think of human trafficking as a financial crime and a violent crime, but not a crime around morality based on if people think prostitution should be legal or not. In this topic in the United States, CSEC, especially if you go into social work, will be the term you hear most often, the commercial sexual exploitation of children. Domestic minor sex trafficking, or DMST, is something you also hear. Those two terms mean that that victim has to be under the age of 18. DMST means that that victim has to be US born and a US citizen. I prefer CSE because that encompasses people who are trafficked even after the age of 18, and you don't have to have any US citizenship requirement for that term to apply to you. So this is the California Penal Code that defines human trafficking, 236.1. And it's very simple, depriving the personal liberty of another with the intent to obtain forced labor or services. So this can be sex trafficking or labor trafficking. Some of the more interesting, I guess you could say, or less known trafficking that exists in California is people being forced to work in meth labs, people being forced to work on marijuana grows. So that's something just to keep in mind as we talk about decriminalization of drugs in California, that there may be some people who are forced to work in that economy. The creation and distribution of photos that are pornographic in nature, this is really important, especially here at Sonoma State. If you sext with somebody or you take a video of them that's sexual in nature and then you distribute it to them, that under the letter of the law is human trafficking in California. There have been some very tragic situations where people have been drugged and sexual videos have been taken of them, and then bullying occurs after that. So those are human trafficking charges that could be put against you. That's a 10-year minimum sentence in state prison, as well as a sex offender registry for life. So forced fraud and coercion. A lot of people think that human trafficking is somebody kidnapped off the street, put into a van, forced to be chained and provide sexual services. Forced fraud and coercion can be very subtle. One of the most common ways that I see victims being lured into sex trafficking is somebody on Facebook. You have a young woman on Facebook. It doesn't always have to be a female victim or a male victim, but those are the cases I see most often. So in several cases I'm working on right now as an advocate, the young women have been on Facebook and they have been friend requested by somebody who looks handsome, somebody who has pictures of nice cars and wearing nice clothes. That person will say, I would love to take you out for a date. On that date, that woman, that victim is drugged, sexual pictures are taken of them, and then when they come to and realize what happens, the exploiters oftentimes say, I will send these pictures to everyone in your family or everyone at your school if you don't do what I'm telling you to do. So that forced fraud and coercion, that doesn't have to be somebody kidnapped, it doesn't have to be somebody chained up. The forced fraud and coercion is oftentimes, many times, psychological in nature. So for those of you who are going to go into fields in social work, W&I stands for Welfare and Institutions Code. There's been some recent legislation in the state recognizing how prevalent sex trafficking is, particularly for kids who are growing up in foster care. So if a child is declared a 300B2 in the eyes of the law, that child can be put into specialized foster care or specialized group homes to receive trauma therapy. In some counties like Alameda County, there's something called the criminalized victim, where victims of human trafficking are recognized to be in existence, and then those children, under the theory of keeping them safe for their own good, are put into a juvenile detention facility and basically incarcerated because they've been victims. So we'll talk about some of the racial prejudices and the racial disproportionality as we go further on about which survivors are given services and which survivors who are put into detention settings. It's often very skewed based on race. The Trafficking Victim Protection Act, this was passed in the early 2000s. This was the law that no longer required somebody to be moved across a state line or moved across a country line. And it also makes the delineation that there's a difference between smuggling and human trafficking. Many times people pay a third party to help them cross a border. Then when they're here in the United States, that relationship is over. That would be smuggling. Human trafficking is when those two people get to the United States and cross a line, and then the person who was promised a good life is forced into either sex trafficking or labor trafficking. So I put this piece around tribal jurisdiction, and I left it here for Sonoma County. So in Sonoma County, we have the Grayton Rancheria, which is tribal land. It's a federally recognized tribe, and the casino is on tribal land. So many times human traffickers, exploiters, will force sex trafficking victims to go into casinos and to make dates. They'll force them to prostitute in that setting. We have a new hotel that's going to be next to Grayton Rancheria. So law enforcement here in Santa Rosa and Sonoma County are working very hard to train casino employees and hotel staff about what it often looks like when somebody's coming into a hotel and being forced to sex traffic themselves. Proposition 35. In the United States, the anti-trafficking movement has historically been very faith-based. There's a lot of churches, Christian-based, that have taken up this issue as a cause, which can be wonderful. However, it can be very jarring and very inappropriate for survivors of sex trafficking who are not Christian and who are LGBT, queer kids who've been kicked out of their home oftentimes for faith-based reasons. So Proposition 35 was funded by a Southern Baptist group that believes that homosexuality is wrong. It was passed with an 85% voter approval rating in California. It's the law in our state that was passed with the highest voter approval rating in history. It was written up on the ballot as very simple. It said tough on trafficking and services for victims. Now, those services, in actuality, money is given from the state to go into faith-based agencies. So I put this up here because sometimes laws can look fabulous on the ballot, but it's really important to read further, especially finding out who is funding these bills. We know that victims are often very trauma bonded to their exploiters. It's similar to Stockholm Syndrome, where people are taken captive and they begin to identify against their exploiters. So what we're seeing in a lot of counties are victims are being exploited by somebody. That exploiter will say to them, I know you're tired. I know that you've been working around the clock. If you go find us somebody else to work for us, you can take a break. Or if you don't go find us somebody else to work with us and make money, I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to kill your children, or I'm going to call child welfare and make sure that your children are taken away and put into foster care. So it's very common for somebody who's a victim of human trafficking to be terrified of testifying against the person who's exploiting them. So in many counties, what prosecutors are doing is they're saying to this victim, if you don't testify against your exploiter, we're going to charge you with human trafficking. You're going to lose your children. You're going to go to prison for 10 years. You're going to be a sex offender for life. You're no longer going to be eligible for public housing. I was able to leave my exploiter because I had financial aid, because I had subsidized housing, because I was not viewed in the eyes of the law as somebody who was a sex offender who was forced to recruit others. I was terrified of going forward to the police because I was really scared, and rightfully so, that I would be viewed as the criminal in the situation. So again, it's just really important to look at these laws, especially when they sound a little too good to be true. So this one, for some reason, is a duplicate slide. 300 in W&I Welfare and Institutions Code, it is that juvenile who is considered a ward of the state. 601, these are kids who've run away. A lot of times kids run away from group homes after they've been identified as trafficking victims because the group homes are very punitive in nature. When we put kids into group homes where they're treated like criminals, again, it's going to make what that exploiter is offering sometimes much more appealing. Exploiters oftentimes will give intermittent rewards and will say, when you're with me, at least we can go shopping, or at least we can get our nails done. When you're in that group home, you don't have any rights, you don't have any freedom. And then 602, kids who are juvenile delinquents, kids who are forced into sex trafficking are also very often forced to commit drug-related crimes and violent-related crimes. So we do see kids who are crossovers and what are called dual status, who are victims of human trafficking, but also considered a juvenile delinquent and locked up oftentimes. So the Indian Child Welfare Act, we have dozens of federally recognized Native American tribes here in California. Children who are of Native American descent are disproportionately affected by the foster care system. There's a historical legacy in California of children being removed from their tribes and being sent to faith-based schools where their hair was cut, where they were no longer allowed to speak their language, and names were changed to more anglicized names. So in many tribal communities, when families need help, they're terrified of going forward to the police or to social services because the true fear of having their children taken away is so great. And then Assembly Bill 12. A lot of kids, many kids, when they reached the age of 18, if they had grown up in foster care, they were literally put out in the street with a garbage bag of their belongings. That was the end of services. In California, until you're 21 now, you're allowed to get a stipend for housing, as well as a stipend to go to school if you would like to continue in the foster care system and receive services. For a lot of kids who've grown up in the system, they say, forget it, I'm done. But a lot of those kids then go out and realize that it can be pretty difficult to go forward without the support of some financial aid. So until kids are 21, they can decide to go back in. Somebody at 18 can see, later, I don't want to talk to my social worker. But 6 months later decide, okay, I'd like a little help. And they can do that back and forth until 21. There's new legislation that will allow former foster children to receive services until they're 26 years old. So we had a Senate bill that required the creation of that new subsection to protect kids who were commercially sexually exploited. Assembly Bill 1585, I call this my favorite law ever on the books. It allows for the expungement or the taking away of a conviction for somebody who was forced into prostitution, who was a victim of human trafficking. We see people who have been prostituted and human trafficking survivors have tons of prostitution-related offenses on their criminal histories. Because a lot of times law enforcement would view somebody outside who was being in prostitution, who looked like they were picking up dates or who were picked up in vice stings, and that would be a prostitution conviction on their record, making it very difficult to get employment. So now people can go to the public defender's office and tell their story. There doesn't have to be a criminal case. There can be a letter from a therapist stating that, yes, in fact, this person was a victim of human trafficking, and that record will be wiped away. It's really powerful for somebody who's been a criminalized victim to be able to stand in court and have a judge say, I believe you. So there's a number that's used on federal sites. It's used by many really well-known anti-trafficking agencies, and it says that between 300,000 and 600,000 youth are at risk of being trafficked every year. This number is false, and the researchers who compiled this number never meant for it to be disseminated in such a broad way. These researchers have in fact asked these anti-trafficking agencies to no longer use this number. We don't know what this number is. It could be higher, it could be lower, it could be on par. But why it's really important to look at these statistics is that we have to take the money that's available for services and give them where they're really needed. The numbers that we do know around human trafficking is that approximately 40% of homeless youth identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer. So children who are in this group, this was my population that I fall under. My exploiter said to me, I know your family and your friends are homophobic. If you don't do what I say, I'm going to out you to them. And that fear of being stigmatized by my family was so great that it really kept me under his control for 3 years. And again, we see a lot of children ending up on the street because their family's religious beliefs fall under the mindset that homosexuality is wrong. Native American girls and women are 3 times more likely to experience sexual assault and domestic violence in their lifetime. This causes a further risk factor for somebody being vulnerable to a trafficker who's offering a better way of life. Traffickers oftentimes come on very thick with the romantic promises. I know you've been treated terribly by other men. Let me treat you better. I promise that I'll give you a better life. And that is really that trauma bond that begins, is that survivors fall in love oftentimes. I thought that I was with a man who loved me, so when he forced me to do terrible things that were violent in nature, I had this mentality more of, he loves me, so I guess I deserve this. And then 85% of prostitution-related offenses, prostitution-related incarcerations are women of color. I've talked to security staff at hotels. They're much more likely to think somebody is a prostitute if it's a woman of color coming into the hotel. This is ingrained racism in our society. I was prostituted in hotels and security never called. So women of color are much more often being prostituted outdoors. So law enforcement has a higher chance of seeing these women and feeling that there is cause that they're prostitutes, or doing vice stings or vice raids that are going to disproportionately affect this community. So when you arrest somebody, the very high likelihood of somebody who's being trafficked also having children, that means that you're going to have another population, another generation of children who may go back into foster care because their parents have been incarcerated. And then in California, only 6% of our state population are children of African American descent. However, that population represents 25% of the foster care population. A lot of that has to do with unjust incarcerations of parents. About 50% of the foster care population in the US are Latino parents. Until very recently in Marin County, a parent's documented status, whether or not they had citizenship or a green card, would be looked into by child welfare. If that child had been put into foster care, child welfare would say, well, if we give this parent their child back, there's a risk that they'll flee and they'll go back to their country. And so there are very racially skewed thoughts around what makes a good parent and what makes an unsafe parent. In Humboldt County, just to show this disproportionality of Native American children in the foster care system, only 7% of the population in that county are under the age of 18 children of Native American descent. This number now in 2016 is actually 40% of the foster care population. Children who have disabilities, children who are going to get Social Security payments, exploiters are very financially driven. So if you have a child who has a disability, if they're going to be receiving any sort of government check or stipend, an exploiter is going to view that as somebody who has even more money for them to control. Per capita payments in some tribal communities in California and across the nation. For one example, the Yurok tribe in Humboldt County sells their lumber, and so there are these payments that are kept in trust for children when they reach the age of 18. So in certain tribal communities, what social workers are seeing is an exploiter meeting a young Native American person saying, I love you. When you turn 18, you're going to have this big check so we can start our life together. But if you let me take care of that money, I'm older, I know how to take care of that money. So the sexual exploitation can begin as well as that exploiter having a check, sometimes $10,000 or $15,000. That's really supposed to set up that young child for life, being taken and being spent by that exploiter. In Marin County, we see youth from high income brackets being exploited as well as being the exploiters. There's the notion that all pimps, all traffickers, all exploiters are men of color. Not the case at all. My exploiter was a well-to-do white man with a pretty good education, and he didn't have enough. He wanted more. And we also see kids from high-income bracket families being exploited. We know that kids who grow up in wealthier families are often left alone for longer, and they often have more access to the internet without their parents checking, more access to devices, which gives them that vulnerability of being contacted by a potential exploiter online. So we talked about this physical limitations, kids who are going to get disability payments. In a lot of the cases I see, kids who have been removed from their parents have fetal alcohol spectrum disorders or have had in utero drug exposure. So kids with these diagnoses often very many times grow up being sort of these problem children who are labeled by schools. So again, an exploiter will latch onto that and say, I know that you've been bullied, I know you've been told that you're less than, but you're beautiful, let me take care of you. So there's an expression that I really urge people not to use. It's modern day slavery. I don't like that expression because it kind of sounds like we had slavery in the US and then it went away and now it's in a vacuum again for no reason. Slavery has existed from the time of first contact in the United States, from the time that we had settlers, from the time that we had the Spanish mission system, and it's never ended. It was legal until the 1860s to enslave members of Native American communities for sex trafficking purposes and labor trafficking purposes. Slavery was legal in the South when California was being settled. So many African American men were taken from the South and brought here to California to work on the railroads and the gold mines. The town of Benicia here in the Bay Area was actually founded by African American men who found enough gold that they were able to purchase their freedom. And then from 1911 to 2002, this was something my thesis advisor here, Professor Lena McQuaid, gave me the stat. The Mann Act, M-A-N-N, was the law on the books around human trafficking. And it was mainly used to prosecute African American men who had sexual relations with white women. There was this false notion of white slavery, that women were going to be snatched off the street and sold to black men. Very racially biased and never found to be true. There was no statistic that backed up this claim. So Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart is an amazing woman. She's of Lakota descent. She now teaches at Columbia Medical School in New York City. For her bachelor's degree and master's degree, she studied intergenerational poverty and isolation and mental health disorders on her own tribe. And then for her PhD, she looked at communities who had been enslaved. She looked at Japanese American communities that had been put in internment camps during World War II. She looked at Jewish Holocaust survivors, and she came up with this term, historical trauma. She defines it as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations emanating from group trauma experiences. So within this definition, she finds symptoms that are not a part of a historical legacy of a people or of a culture, including poverty, racism, violence, substance abuse, and incest. Essentially, these are symptoms that have been put upon an isolated and oppressed community. These are not historical remnants or historical legacies of cultures. So we talked about some of these punitive responses in the human trafficking movement. A lot of times kids are put into juvenile hall. When I read referrals for housing for a group home that I consult with, I read these referrals of kids who have been listed as victims, yet they've been put in juvenile hall for months on end. So the social workers label them as at risk for running away from group homes. I try to tell these social workers, please put yourself into the mindset of a 15 or a 16-year-old who's been in foster care their entire life, is then told that they're a victim, and then is locked up. It's very jarring, discombobulating. Kids are smarter than many social workers often give them credit for. And then the deportation of undocumented victims. For those of you who are interested in immigrant rights, there was a case in Sacramento last year of a young 16-year-old woman who was from a Latin American country, She was brought here to the United States by her family when she was very young. They didn't have immigration papers. She was forced into a gang in her community. And in that gang, she was forced to commit drug and violent-related crimes. And she was also forced into sex trafficking. So she was picked up and put into juvenile hall in Sacramento on those drug and violent-related crimes. In juvenile hall, a social worker realized that she was a victim of sex trafficking and said, wait a second, she's an undocumented victim of a violent crime. We have this federal law that allows her to seek asylum. This law has been on the books since about 2002. Called in an immigration attorney to work on behalf of that victim. At the same time, Sacramento County decided to call immigration and begin deportation proceedings for this child. So this case went all the way up to the appeals court, and the appeals court in California found that Sacramento County could actually deport this young victim, even though the federal law protects her immigration status. So even here in California, we're seeing that victims of undocumented status are very often being treated differently depending on which county they're in. In Marin County, one thing I'm very proud to say is that for cases like this, immigration is actually not allowed into the jail. So different counties are kind of working creatively. Our probation department runs our jail with the sheriff's office, and they have said that for nonviolent crimes, we're not going to allow immigration to come in and begin deportation proceedings. It's very punitive in nature. And oftentimes, undocumented folks who are incarcerated also have a right to seek asylum. Something I also see social workers do a lot of times, child welfare institutions do, is separate siblings because they're afraid that they're going to be a bad influence on one another. This is something that's really terrifying and very common in the child welfare system. So I'll see cases where one young woman is being exploited, one young woman is being sex trafficked. She'll still live in a foster care situation with one family or be with their family of origin. And the social workers say, we should separate them so that that young child isn't a bad influence. I like to tell people that my sister and I, we were each other's worst influences and our only allies. If we had been separated when we were growing up, I don't think either of us would have had the resiliency as young adults to survive and get out of some of the precarious situations we found ourselves in. So there's neurobiological responses to trauma. We know by doing brain research, neurologists do MRIs, that when somebody goes through trauma, particularly as a child, their brain actually looks different. The right lobe and the left lobe do not relate to each other in the way that people's brains work if you have not been traumatized. So anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, self-harming, something that's very common when I'm working with someone who's been trafficked is that they'll cut themselves. Eating disorders, sleep disorders. We know that much of sex work takes place at night. So one way to know, have sort of an indicator commonly is that if somebody's very sleepy, if you think that they're being trafficked and they're not getting adequate sleep, it'll be hard for them to stay in school. And then this hypervigilance of real distrust, because again, exploiters will often say, if you leave me, you're just gonna be arrested, or if you leave me and you're in foster care and you hate it there, you're just gonna be put back. So trauma bonding, I've talked about this, how it's sometimes called Stockholm Syndrome. Using secrets against a victim to strengthen that bond. Forcing a victim to engage in shameful and humiliating violent sexual acts. This is very, very common. And this is common on college campuses, even when the victim is not sex trafficked. The amount of students on college campuses who are sexually assaulted, we know this is an epidemic. This is something that's rampant. So much of that, most of those sexual assaults that happen on campus are because somebody has either been drugged or that there's heavy drinking involved. So there can be a lot of shame around that when a victim will say, but I drank. It doesn't matter. It's not a permission or consent just because somebody's intoxicated. So anybody familiar with the term harm reduction? Okay, so harm reduction came about in the 1980s during the war on drugs. It was found to be that AA and regular step programs for drug abuse and for alcohol abuse were not working for some people. And at the same time, the HIV and AIDS epidemic was on the rise. So the harm reduction movement said, some people may not be able to stop doing drugs or doing something that's dangerous, but we can at least give them clean needles. We can at least give them methadone instead of heroin if they would like to stop. And then this movement trickled into providing condoms to people, saying, we know that you're gonna have sex, we know that you might be at risk of contracting this deadly disease, but if you use a condom, at least your risk is going to be down. So the harm reduction theory has now gone into the anti-trafficking movement, where we'll say to people, we know you might be too afraid to leave your exploiter, or we know that you have a lot of reasons for staying in this situation, but at least know where you can go for help, at least know which clinics are available, at least know which social workers are not going to be punitive in their response to you. The stages of change, if you guys decide to go into social work, this is a theory that you're going to hear. It's more on the rise. And it's a spiral, a continuum of behavior that was created around understanding substance abuse. The first one, pre-contemplation with human trafficking, is when somebody is strongly trauma bonded to their exploiter. It's going to be really hard to provide services if you're a social worker or a peer advocate. Contemplation oftentimes happens when somebody starts to feel guilty about other exploiters' victims. So for me, this happened when I found child pornography in the possession of the man who was exploiting me. He had done so many terrible things to me, but I could not handle the notion that other people were being harmed. This started to break that trauma bond. And even though I was afraid that he was going to out me and my family would disown me, the choice was clear. I needed to get ready to leave. Preparation, making plans. Oftentimes survivors will start to kind of keep a little bit of money to the side if they're being forced to prostitute, or will find out which shelters are available. And then action, obtaining the resources to find safety. Sometimes it's not a huge momentous thing that helps somebody move through the stages of change. For me, in 2001, it's when the Destiny's Child CD came out that had the song Bootylicious. I love Beyonce, I love Destiny's Child. I was in Costco with my exploiter. He was buying a bunch of food and wine, and I wanted to get this Destiny's Child CD. And he said, absolutely not, you're not allowed to get that. And I had this moment of clarity where I felt like, you've done so many things to me, but you're taking away my music. It was a month and a half later that I left him. And so when I hear songs from that CD, when I hear Bootylicious or Survivor that came from that 2001 CD, this is the perfect example of action. Maintenance. For anybody who's gone through substance abuse struggles or traumatic struggles, whether they be mental health related, sexual assault related, maintenance really is this notion around we're going to be survivors for the rest of our lives. There's never going to come a point where I'm totally okay with what happened to me, but I recognize who my safe peer networks are. I recognize that there's a lot of resources in the community that I can go to safely. Relapse is a term that I think is punitive in nature, because I think oftentimes when people relapse into drug abuse or when somebody goes back to their exploiter, it's because they weren't able to find enough resources. There are survivors that I work with who I cannot find them the appropriate housing, I cannot find them jobs good enough to support themselves and their children. Sometimes those victims go back to those exploitation situations because it truly is the only way to keep a roof over their head and enough food on the table. So relapse often happens when the services that us advocates try to find are just not good enough, and that's a really sad reality. So Monique Graysmith, if you Google her, she's a fantastic woman. She also works with tribal kids. She grew up in Canada. She's a First Nations Canadian woman. And she talks about how there's these 4 blankets of resiliency that we need to cover children with. In many Indigenous cultures, blankets are literally used in ceremony to protect and to bless children. So for her, she utilizes this in the foster care system by saying that first sense of self you need to give a young person, any person, whether or not they're trafficked or not, is this sense of self, physical education, financial literacy. A lot of exploiters will talk a victim into getting a car loan or will talk a victim into getting a credit card, will then ruin their credit so that victim is unable to rent an apartment. And so if we teach young people about credit scores, about financial literacy, the notion is that even if they're exploited, they'll have some tools for getting out of that. A sense of family, connections to family of origin and family of choice. I like to say that even though I have a sister who I love very much, the sisters I call my true sisters, the women that I can talk to the most openly, are other friends of mine who have been exploited. So recognizing that being exploited and having a community of other people, if you know somebody who's been trafficked, that's a normal thing. You don't have to discourage relationships if you love somebody or know somebody who was trafficked and they still want to have some connections to that old life. Sense of community and belonging. It's really important when working with kids who've been in the system, if they have a foster family, if they have a social worker, if they have a probation officer, everybody in that young person's life who is helping them, that's somebody who's catching a check. That's somebody who's making money off of them, which can sometimes feel like being exploited further by the system. So there's a lot of mentorship opportunities if you guys are interested. Verity here in Sonoma County is an amazing sexual assault resource agency. Missy in the East Bay, if you're interested in being a mentor for somebody, donating your time, a couple hours a month to be there for a kid and not get any money for that work. It can be really, really empowering for a young person, just that there's a human being in the world who cares for them regardless of if they're making money. And then the sense of culture, language, connection to heritage, ceremony, honoring a culture a survivor has been exposed to while being exploited. I think that learning about other cultures, indigenous communities is something you really have the opportunity to do here at Sonoma State University. Had it not been for the Women's and Gender Studies program, I don't think myself as a white woman would have realized how important it was to talk about disproportionality of incarceration and in foster care of children of color, communities of color. So I really applaud WGS for helping to strengthen bonds on that topic. So appropriate resources. What's a little bit terrifying in the human trafficking movement is that any agency or any human being can call themselves an anti-trafficking agency. There's no special certificate they need to have, like a domestic violence advocate or a sexual assault advocate needs to have to work with victims. So whenever I'm providing resources to somebody, I have this criteria. I need to know how long somebody can stay in a shelter. There's a local shelter in Marin County that says they provide services to victims of human trafficking. Time and time again, I hear that women who are trafficking survivors are told that they can only stay a week or two, whereas other women are allowed to stay 3 to 6 months. So if there's an agency that has disproportionate or disparate services to trafficking survivors, I no longer refer to them. Track record of being very diligent, of being very trauma-informed and kind and compassionate and non-stigmatizing. And then the sexual assault resource training, if any of you are interested in working with someone who's a sex trafficking survivor, again, I'd recommend looking into Verity. I think that they also offer internship opportunities that you can use for credit for some of your classes here. And then faith-based services are optional. As far as I know, there's only one human trafficking-related service provider here in Sonoma County, other than Verity. This other organization provides housing, but you do need to attend scripture and Bible classes in order to stay there. So again, an agency like this is not going to be a service I'm going to refer most of my clients to. And then making sure if you're working with somebody who has a particular language requirement or is from a community or a background where they really want a lot of support around their cultural identity, there's many resources available here in the Bay Area. If you're working with somebody or you know somebody who you think is being trafficked, please contact me and I'll help you find some appropriate resources for them. So it's amazing to celebrate when somebody is able to leave their exploiter. Even if they're not able to leave permanently, just knowing that somebody who's going through post-traumatic stress disorder is often very tired. It's a huge task just to get out of bed every day and live with that trauma. So if you're working with somebody or you know somebody in your class who is trafficked and they're able to go to school, even if they're not making straight A's, even if they're a C student with kind of iffy attendance, you have to celebrate that and you have to really applaud them for just literally getting out of bed in the morning. So I'm really appreciative to be here today, appreciative to be back at Sonoma State University. I know it's a dense topic. I know it's something that might feel a little bit foreign to people. My email is here and very accessible. It usually just takes me a couple of days to get back to people. So please feel free to contact me if you'd like to.
A hero of Marin County, a hero of California, I would say. We have 5 minutes. Let's get some questions.
No question is silly. Any question is welcome. So, sure, so the question is, why are Native American women and girls more likely to be sexually assaulted? It's a historical legacy from the time of first contact. Native American women and girls were viewed as less than human, were allowed to be enslaved for sex trafficking purposes. They were some of the first women who were brought to San Francisco to be used as prostitutes for the gold miners who were coming to San Francisco and coming to California. So this legacy has continued on. There are a lot of sexual predators who go on to tribal land knowing that their possibility of being arrested and prosecuted is very low.
I have a question.
Sure.
Most of what we've been talking about this term is about, as I mentioned, globalization issues, large international issues. To what extent do you see those kinds of issues weighing into the concerns that you deal with?
Sure. So I see a lot of people from other countries who are brought to the United States and are trafficked in restaurants or are trafficked as maids or nannies. There's often a co-occurrence of sex trafficking in those situations. I think that sex trafficking has too much of a spotlight on it in terms of trafficking as a whole in the United States. Robert Reich, a professor at Berkeley, says that hypercapitalism is a form of human trafficking. So we exist in a society that's, the United States was based on slavery. That's how our country began. So most human beings who come to the United States for a better life, if human trafficking is not the situation, under market rates or below minimum wage, wages are going to often be given to that human being. Labor rights violations and human trafficking, they go like this. There can often really be a crossover where somebody won't view themselves as a human trafficking victim, but For example, there was a Thai restaurant up in Eureka, and the couple had brought 20 people over from Thailand and said, you're going to give us your passports now, and you're going to work here until you pay off the price of your plane ticket, until you pay off the price of the housing and the food we're giving you. That's human trafficking, but for a lot of people coming from other countries, that can be thought of as just the price you pay to get to the United States. I know who you are.
You said that Proposition 35 was really bad law. What can we do to change that law?
Sure. Yeah, so one thing that law enforcement often think of is that without a victim testimony, you can't prosecute offenders. But advocates and I, what we like to do is that when a victim will tell us what their exploiter's name is or what their social media name is, we'll go on Instagram or we'll go on Twitter. Exploiters, especially of sex trafficking, are very bold. And so there have been exploiters who law enforcement wouldn't prosecute them because the victim was too afraid to testify. But on Instagram or on Twitter, we see pictures of stacks of $100 bills or a gun out with the clips of ammunition. So I think law enforcement needs to get a lot more clever in how they're prosecuting these cases. Domestic violence crimes no longer require that victim's testimony if there's enough other physical evidence. And so law enforcement cases that are the most successful will use other elements of evidence so that you're not just relying on that victim testimony. So I try to train as many law enforcement professionals as possible. When I became an advocate with the San Francisco Police Department in 2002, there were officers on the force who had come in when domestic violence wasn't yet a crime. So we're still working in a culture where 10 years ago, 5 years ago, children were arrested and called child prostitutes and locked up. So I think that incrementally, law enforcement is going to realize that unless they prosecute purely the exploiters, we're just going to create this cycle. I have a really open dialogue with the district attorney in Alameda County who believes that locking up children for their safety is a solution. I'm kind of a thorn in her side because I constantly send her write-ups of the cases where this didn't work and where this child was harmed further. I also am okay making a really small salary because I've made adjustments in my life to have really modest needs, but I understand not all advocates can be as vocal, and I'm definitely way left of when it comes to this topic. Long answer to your question.
Can I ask just one more thing?
Sure.
You spoke to me eloquently about how valuable your Sonoma State education was. Do you have any words of wisdom for these folks?
Yeah. So of the classmates that I know from the Women's and Gender Studies program who were getting their bachelor's degrees, they have gone on to get into the schools they want to go to for graduate school. All of them, without exception, even if they're not making huge money, they are doing things that are absolutely giving them wealth and giving them satisfaction. I have had a lot of great interactions with my professors even after graduating. It is one of those small schools where you can get really specific in what you're studying. There were times when I was writing things in WGS and I was a master's student allowed to take these upper division classes where I felt, oh my gosh, how did I not know this? So there's times when you just really have to let yourself be humble, don't feel stupid, and just really keep in contact with your professors. When I was pregnant, in my last part of graduate school, and so I had horrible morning sickness, and I would be sitting in Lena's class feeling like I was going to throw up. But because it was a smaller school, I just let her know how I was feeling. So trust in the fact that if you talk to your professors here at Sonoma State, I would say that the majority of the time they're really going to have your backs.